The question now is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the member for Wannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and could I associate myself with those concluding remarks from the member for Brand, and also commend the member for Eden Monero for his speech as well, which was a bit of a tour de force of the dairy industries in his electorate, which I must say I found most interesting. We have before us today a bill, and I'm glad to see that the bill is supported from both sides. Unfortunately, we have an amendment to the motion for second reading which has been moved by the opposition, the Shadow Minister for Agriculture, and I'll come to that because I don't think this bill really needs sort of cheap political point scoring associated with it, because it's a serious bill and it's a bill which both sides know is non-controversial, and I think is a very good opportunity for people to come into this chamber and talk about the importance of agriculture, to talk about the importance of agriculture to their community, to talk how agriculture provides much-needed employment for people in regional and rural Australia, but also for people in urban Australia as well. And it's very good that the member for Brand gave us a very good speech on where Western Australia fits in that regard, and I'm sure we've already heard from one of the members from New South Wales. My good friend from Tasmania will follow me, and I'm sure he'll give us a very good speech on the wonderful dairy interests in that wonderful state of Tasmania. So it's an example where we can, on all sides of the chamber, come in here and remember that when the GFC hit, for instance, the thing that kept us out of recession, the sector which kept us out of recession, was the agriculture sector. The sector which still provides this country with much needed agricultural export dollars is the agricultural sector. And it is good that we can come in here and point all this out and use this opportunity. So what is this bill about? It's the Primary Industries Excise Levies Amendment Dairy Produce Bill of 2014. And just to go over the context of the bill increases the maximum permitted rates of the Australian Animal Health Council levies on dairy produce from 0.058 to 0.145 of a cent per kilogram of milk fat, and from 0.13850 to 0.34625 of a cent per kilogram of milk protein. Australian dairy farmers requested the increases in the maximum rates in the Excise Levies Act to provide a platform for the next decade to enable it to continue to meet its obligations as a partner with government and other livestock industries to the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement. It is important to note, and very important to note, the bill will not increase the actual levy payable by industry members and does not impose a financial burden on dairy farmers. And I think everyone in this place would welcome that. The Australian dairy industry is vital for the nation. The dairy industry of southwest Victoria is vital for my electorate of Wannon. It is the largest dairy producing area in the country, and as a result we have also dairy processors in my seat. We have Fonterra, we have Murray Goulburn, and we have Warrnambool Cheese and Butter, which is, as we all know, has recently been taken over by Saputo, the Canadian company. And the industry provides much-needed jobs. We also have Lion with processing interests as well in my electorate. It provides much-needed jobs, much-needed incomes, but also supports dairy farmers in my electorate. And dairy farmers work hard, provide local employment and contribute to the community in a significant way. And they not only help our local community and help jobs locally, but they also provide much-needed export income. Now, the dairy industry in my electorate this time last year was in a great deal of pain. We had one of the driest 9 months in what is usually a reliable rainfall area that we had seen. Prices were low, the cost of fodder and grain to feed the dairy herds were expensive, and cash reserves were run down and debts on farm began to increase. Now, fortunately, we had the best thing that could happen to farmers, and particular dairy farmers in my region. We got towards the middle and end of last year substantial rainfall. In some cases, farmers were able to cut silage, hay and more silage, and they've put that away, which means that they have it there in reserve, because for those uninitiated to dairying, grass is the best thing that you can provide a dairy cow to make sure you get very good milk, and Australia produces the best milk. Not only did we get good rainfalls which led to good grass growth, which meant that farmers could restock on their fodder, but we also saw, through the battle for Warrnambool cheese and butter, people begin to understand the importance of this sector and what it can provide to this nation. We saw an overseas company, Saputo. We saw 2 local companies, Bega and Murray Goulburn, bid for this company, and we saw the share price more than double. And it gave great confidence to the industry to know that people saw it as worthwhile and as valuable. Now, in the end of that process, Saputo won. There were a couple of things, a couple of lessons that we need to learn from the process, but Saputo in the end won because it was able to convince the shareholders of Warrnambool Cheese and Butter and the board that it was the best option. Murray Goulburn were also very keen to purchase the asset, but had to go through the Australian Competition Tribunal to get the ability to be able to put a wholehearted bid on the table. Unfortunately, that process takes some time, and one of the things that we need to look at is, as part of our review of competition policy, is whether we need to re-look at the process of when something is taken to the Australian Competition Tribunal and whether that process can be sped up. I will say though, Mr Deputy Speaker, that it was quite clear from the outset the rules and hoops and the regulations that all companies would need to go to as part of the battle for Warrnambool cheese and butter when the process started. And I must say it was very pleasing to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister down to my electorate of Wannon last Friday to speak at the SunGold Dairy Field Days, the largest dairy field days in this nation. And SunGold is one of the products which is produced by Warrnambool cheese and butter. And the Deputy Prime Minister gave a very insightful speech of the future, of where he saw the future of agriculture and the Australian dairy industry over the next few years. One of the more interesting things that he said was that our need as a nation to understand the importance of our agricultural assets and to encourage Australian investors, whether they be superannuants, whether they be private investors, to realise how important our agricultural assets are to us, and also on the potential returns they can give us over the years to come. And I'd like to once again place on the record my thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister for coming down and speaking at the luncheon of that very important field day. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to just turn to the, I would probably describe it as pious amendment put forward by those opposite, mentioning that whilst not declining to give the bill a second reading, the House notes the failure of the government to act urgently in response to the effect of the drought on the dairy and other agricultural sectors and the omission of resource sustainability in the terms of reference for the government's agricultural white paper. I'll just address drought for a minute. The government was left with a non-existent drought policy by those opposite. So we have had to systematically, methodically and carefully put together a package, and that is what we have done, and that is under active consideration as we speak, and I'm sure that we will hear in the very near future on what the government is going to do in this area. But for those opposites to make these points, cheap political point scoring on this matter, I think is contemptible. They left us with no money. And so what we've had to do is do the best we can to come up with a policy. And I have full confidence, following the Prime Minister's tour of drought-affected areas, that that's exactly what the government is going to do. It is also remiss of those opposite to talk about terms of reference being left out of the agricultural white paper. The agricultural white paper process, and the member for Eden Monaro set it out in detail, is once again going to be a very systematic, very considered approach to what do we need to guarantee the future of this great industry to our nation. And it is going to focus on what is the key area, because without this, nothing else follows around it. And that is, how do we ensure that the sector remains profitable? Because if you can't have the profitability, you can forget about the sustainability and all those other issues which flow on from that. Profitability is what we need to drive into the sector. And if those opposite are serious about making this white paper process a proper one, the first thing they could do is take away the most serious burden on the industry at the moment, and that is the carbon tax. They should go and talk to Murray Goulburn about the carbon tax bill that they have to pay, and they should go out and talk to individual dairy farmers. Individual dairy farmers who are currently going to have to pay 7 to 10, when they're big operations, $15,000 per annum for the carbon tax. And that is before we see the impact on fuel added come July 1. So rather than putting forward these pious amendments, why don't they look at what are the imposts on the sector at the moment? And there is one impost which they could fix, and fix immediately, and that is getting rid of the carbon tax. So don't come in with these cheap political point scoring exercises. Do your research, do your homework, and look at what's in the long-term interests of the sector. And if you do that, you will start to realise regulation must be fixed. We must fix the taxation system, in particular the carbon taxation system, and we must also ensure that there is that much needed flexibility in the workplace that a sector like the dairy industry needs, because obviously during milking times mornings and afternoons, there is a greater need for labour than there is in the rest of the day. So I commend this bill to the House, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the fact that on the substance of the bill, both sides are in favour of it.
I thank the member for Wannon.